Rodrigo Castellanos had the kind of life that, from the outside, seemed complete. A 7-bedroom house in the Valle Alto neighborhood of Monterrey, with its own garden, a 3-car garage, and a pool he used every morning at 6:15 without fail. 54 years old, with graying hair, and the hands of a man who had once worked with them before learning to sign checks. He had built a logistics distribution company from the ground up, grown it over 2 decades, and now managed it with the calmness of someone who no longer has anything to prove. From the outside, everything made sense. From the inside, the house had that specific silence known only to those who have lost someone without ever fully getting used to their absence. His wife, Fernanda, had died 4 years earlier. Pancreatic cancer, a late diagnosis, 7 months shuttling between the hospital and home before it all ended one early Wednesday morning with a stillness that Rodrigo still didn't know how to describe when someone asked him. They had no children. They had talked about adopting once, on a trip to Oaxaca, with a bottle of mezcal between them and plenty of time ahead. They never mentioned it again. Rodrigo reorganized his life with the discipline of someone who won't allow himself to break down because he doesn't know what he would do next. He kept running the company, kept swimming at 6:15, kept going to the same restaurant on Fridays with the same 2 old friends. He kept counting on Consuelo. Consuelo Ibarra had been in that house for 12 years. She had arrived when Fernanda was still alive, when there was more activity, more noise, more reasons to keep everything in order. She had stayed when the noise disappeared. She knew every one of Rodrigo's habits with that silent precision that comes only with the years. That the coffee had to be brewed in a pot, not from a machine. That on Mondays, nothing was to be moved from his desk, even if it was messy. That when he came home late from the office, it was better to leave his dinner covered in the microwave and not wait for him in the kitchen. Consuelo lived in the maid's room that opened onto the back garden. She had her own bathroom, a window overlooking the ash trees Fernanda had planted the first year they lived in that house, and a routine as fixed as Rodrigo's. They weren't friends. Rodrigo was careful about that distinction, not out of coldness but out of mutual respect, the kind that builds in silence and needs no naming. In 12 years, Consuelo had never missed a day without giving notice days in advance. Rodrigo knew little about her personal life. He knew she sent money to Saltillo every 2 weeks. He knew she had a daughter studying graphic design, about whom she spoke with a mixture of pride and concern that Rodrigo recognized without being able to explain why. Consuelo said the girl was smart, that she had talent, that sometimes she was too impulsive for her own good. Rodrigo listened and nodded. He'd had no reason to think about it any further. One Thursday in March, Consuelo walked into the kitchen with a different look on her face. It wasn't exactly joy. It was something more restrained, more nervous. "My daughter is coming this weekend," she said as she arranged the glasses in the dish rack. She had a problem with her apartment in Saltillo. A leak, she says. The landlord left her hanging for weeks. She needs a few days while she finds a place to stay. Rodrigo put down the newspaper. "How many days?" "No more than 2 weeks. I can set up a cot in my room. It doesn't take up any space." Rodrigo looked at her for a moment. The house had 6 unused bedrooms. "Let her stay in the guest room," he said. "There's no point in them being cramped." Consuelo nodded with something that wasn't quite a smile but looked like one. She said thank you in a low voice. Rodrigo went back to his newspaper. He didn't give it any more thought. He had no reason to yet. Valeria Ibarra arrived on Saturday afternoon with a large suitcase, a backpack slung over her shoulder, and 20 years she made no attempt to hide. She was slender, with light brown skin, her dark hair pulled back into a bun that had come half undone during the trip. She greeted Rodrigo with a straightforward, "Good afternoon," without excessive formality, looked him in the eye without shyness, and then followed her mother down the hallway toward the guest room without further comment. Rodrigo watched her walk away with the vague sensation that, for the first time in a long while, something he didn't recognize had entered that house. That night, the three of them had dinner in the kitchen because the formal dining room had seemed excessive to Rodrigo for years. Valeria talked about Saltillo, the irresponsible landlord, her high-end clients who paid late and demanded endless revisions. She spoke with her hands, changed the subject naturally, and every now and then asked Rodrigo something with the direct curiosity of someone who isn't afraid to ask questions. Consuelo watched her with that specific expression mothers have when they're assessing whether their child is behaving properly in someone else's home. Rodrigo answered the questions. He spoke more than he normally did at dinner. When they finished, and Consuelo began clearing the plates, Rodrigo remained seated with his glass of water in hand, not getting up immediately. It was a minor detail. No one noticed. But Rodrigo Castellanos had been dining alone for 4 years, and that night he was in no hurry for it to end. The first week passed without incident. Valeria got up late, worked from the guest room with an old laptop and a cup of coffee that grew cold before she remembered to drink it. She had clients in Saltillo and Monterrey, visual identity projects for small businesses, logos, posters, the kind of work that looks simple from the outside, but isn't. Sometimes she'd come down to the kitchen at 11 in the morning, looking like she hadn't slept well, and Consuelo would leave something covered on the stove without saying a word. Rodrigo left early and came back before 7. His routine didn't change. The pool at 6:15, the pot of coffee, the office. What did change, though he didn't mention it, was the speed with which he walked down the hallway when he arrived. Before, he'd go straight into the studio. Now he'd go through the kitchen first. On Tuesday of the second week, Valeria was at the garden table with her laptop and a sketch pad when Rodrigo came home from the office earlier than usual. He stopped at the glass door leading to the garden and watched her for a moment without her noticing. His brow was slightly furrowed, the concentration of someone silently arguing something with himself. The pencil moved quickly across the paper. Rodrigo opened the door, and she looked up. "I didn't know you still used a pencil," he said, not quite sure why he'd said it. "For the first sketches, yes," Valeria replied. "The screen makes me think differently. Not always for the better." Rodrigo nodded as if that made sense, which it did, and went into the house. But instead of going to the study, he went to the kitchen, poured himself some water, and stood by the window overlooking the garden longer than necessary. Consuelo saw him from the hallway. She said nothing. It was during the second week that the dinners began to last longer. Not by agreement, but because the conversations found their own rhythm and no one interrupted them. Valeria asked questions that people Rodrigo's age rarely asked him. How the company had started, what had been the hardest part of the early years, if there was anything he would do differently. It wasn't flattery, it was genuine curiosity, or she knew how to mimic it with a precision that produced the same effect. Rodrigo spoke. He spoke of Fernanda without being asked, something he didn't normally do. He spoke of the years when the company wasn't taking off, and he would come home certain that the next month everything could come crashing down. He spoke with the ease of someone who has spent too long keeping things locked away in rooms no one visits. Valeria listened. She recalled details from previous conversations and brought them up naturally. Was it calculated down to the last millimeter, or was it completely genuine? From the inside, there is no difference. Consuelo cleared the plates and watched. There was something in that dynamic she couldn't quite read. Something moving beneath the words like a current you only sense once it has you in its grip. On Thursday of the third week, Valeria said the problem with the apartment in Saltillo was going to take longer than expected. The landlord had promised repairs that never came. Rodrigo said there was no rush, that the guest room was there, and that it didn't make sense for her to pay rent elsewhere while she sorted things out. He said it with the naturalness of someone making a practical decision. Consuelo, who was in the kitchen, listened from the other side of the door and clenched the dishcloth in her hands without moving. That night, after Rodrigo had gone up to his room, Consuelo went into the guest room and closed the door. "Valeria," she said in a low voice. Her daughter looked up from her laptop. "Rodrigo is a good man," said Consuelo. "He's been good to me for 12 years. "I know, Mom." "Then you know what I'm saying." Valeria looked at her for a moment and then went back to the screen. "You're imagining things." Consuelo didn't answer. She turned off the hallway light and went to her room. That night, she listened to the radio as usual, but it took her much longer to fall asleep. The fourth week, Rodrigo arrived on a Friday with a flat box under his arm. He set it down on the dining room table without ceremony. It was a graphics tablet, the kind professional designers use. He'd picked it out himself, asked at the store, and chosen the model they recommended. "So you don't have to strain your eyes with that laptop," he said, as if it were obvious. Valeria opened the box slowly. She looked at it. Then she looked at him. "It's too much," she said. "It's a work tool," Rodrigo replied. And there it was. Not in the gift itself, in the way he justified it, as if he needed a practical reason for something that was anything but practical. Valeria understood. Rodrigo understood too, even if he didn't say so. The two of them stood in silence for a moment over the open box, and then Valeria said, "Thank you," in a low voice, and Rodrigo nodded and went into the studio. Consuelo had seen everything from the hallway. That night, she didn't go into her daughter's room. There was nothing new to say that Valeria hadn't already decided to ignore. What Consuelo didn't know, what she couldn't know yet, was that 3 days earlier, Valeria had had a long phone call from the backyard, speaking in a low voice, with the phone pressed to her ear and her eyes on the ash trees Fernanda had planted years ago. The call lasted 40 minutes. When it ended, Valeria deleted the log immediately. On the other end of that call was a man Consuelo didn't know. Neither did Rodrigo. No one in that house knew he existed. Not yet. The fifth week, Rodrigo canceled Friday lunch with his friends for the first time in 3 years. He sent them a short message, "Work to catch up on, see you next time," and didn't mention it again. That Friday he came home at 2 in the afternoon, something he hadn't done since the days when Fernanda was sick, and he looked for any excuse to be near her. Valeria was in the garden. Rodrigo changed his clothes and went out to sit at the table under the ash tree. They talked for 3 hours straight, aimlessly, without direction. The way two people talk who no longer need a reason to be in the same place. The next day, one of Rodrigo's friends, Gerardo, called him on his cell phone. Rodrigo let the phone ring until it went to voicemail. It wasn't rudeness. It was something harder to put into words. The unease of someone who knows that if they answer, they'll have to give explanations they don't yet understand. Consuelo noticed the missed call from the kitchen. She also noticed that Rodrigo had started coming home earlier, that he left his phone face down on the table during dinners, that he laughed in a way she hadn't seen since before Fernanda got sick. Each of those things, taken separately, could be innocent. Together they formed a pattern that Consuelo recognized and that caused her a deep, inescapable unease. She didn't speak to Valeria again. Her daughter had a way of listening to her that made it feel as though the conversation had ended before it began. It was during the 6th week that the money started. Not abruptly. Rodrigo wasn't an impulsive man. It was gradual, wrapped in gestures that seemed natural one by one. First was a transfer of 8,000 pesos to Valeria's account because her old laptop had finally broken down and needed a repair that her clients that month wouldn't be able to cover. Rodrigo said it as if he were solving a logistical problem. Valeria accepted it with a brief unease that vanished quickly. Then came 12,000 to cover the months of rent Valeria owed in Saltillo, because the landlord was threatening to keep the deposit, and there were papers to sign. Rodrigo didn't ask for details. The details would have required attention that he had decided, without fully realizing it, not to give. Then, 25,000 because Valeria had a business opportunity. A partner in Guadalajara wanted to open a design studio, and they needed startup capital to buy equipment. It was an investment, Valeria said. They'd recoup it in less than a year. Rodrigo signed off on the transfer from his phone without asking for documentation. In 6 weeks, without any single transaction seeming excessive on its own, Rodrigo had transferred 45,000 pesos to Valeria's account. She withdrew it in installments and sent it to an account Rodrigo didn't know about, at a bank he'd never heard of. What Rodrigo did know, or what he could sense without looking directly, was that Valeria was there. That the house sounded different. That the pool at 6:15 wasn't the first thing he thought of when he woke up anymore. Sometimes that's enough for a man to stop asking questions. One night, during the 7th week, Rodrigo went out to the garden after dinner and found Valeria speaking softly on the phone by the back wall. When she saw him, she ended the call with a naturalness that would have seemed normal had she not tucked the phone into her pocket too quickly. "Everything okay?" Rodrigo asked. "My partner in Guadalajara," Valeria said. "Work stuff." Rodrigo nodded. He went back inside. That night he checked his bank statements from the study with the door closed. 45,000 pesos in transfers. He saw them with the same clarity with which one sees something that has been right in front of one's eyes for weeks. It wasn't an alarming figure for a man with his finances, but it was a figure, and it had a name, and that name was Valeria. He hung up the phone. He turned off the desk lamp. He sat in the darkness of the study for a long moment. The next day he said nothing. What Rodrigo didn't know, what no one in that house knew, was that the man on the other end of those late-night calls was named Ivan. He was 31 years old, lived in a rented apartment in downtown Monterrey, and had been without a steady job for 4 months. He had known Valeria for 2 years. He wasn't exactly her boyfriend, but he wasn't just a friend either. He was, above all, the person Valeria talked to when she needed to think out loud. And lately, she was thinking a lot. Ivan knew about the house in Valle Alto. He knew about the widowed businessman. He knew about the ash trees in the garden, and the pool, and the money that arrived in installments in Valeria's account. He knew, because Valeria had told him, and because the two of them had, during one of those long calls that Valeria deleted immediately, a conversation that neither of them had put in writing. That conversation had taken place 5 weeks before Valeria arrived at Rodrigo Castellanos' house with a large suitcase and a backpack slung over her shoulder. What came next was not improvised. Thursday of the 8th week dawned like any other. Rodrigo got up at 6, did his 20-minute swim in the pool, drank the coffee Consuelo had left ready before 7, and headed to the office with his jacket under his arm as usual. Consuelo watched him leave from the kitchen window. There was nothing different about his posture, his stride, or the way he closed the car door. He was a man who still didn't know what that day would cost him. Valeria slept until 10. She came downstairs barefoot, poured herself some coffee from what was left in the pot, and sat at the garden table with her phone in hand. Consuelo watched her from inside. Valeria had that focused, closed-off expression that appeared whenever she was writing messages she didn't want anyone to read. At 11:30, Valeria went up to her room and didn't come down until the afternoon. Rodrigo returned at 7 with a bag from a wine shop. He was carrying a bottle of red wine he'd chosen with more care than he usually devoted to such things. He set it on the kitchen counter without comment and went upstairs to change. Consuelo looked at the bottle for a moment. It wasn't the brand Rodrigo usually bought when he drank wine alone. It was more expensive. It was a choice made for sharing. Dinner that night was quiet. Rodrigo opened the wine, poured 2 glasses, one for himself and one for Valeria, and left Consuelo's glass empty because Consuelo didn't drink alcohol. and all three of them knew it. They spoke little. There was a new tension between Rodrigo and Valeria, different from the previous weeks, less light-hearted, as if something that had been floating had begun to settle. Consuelo cleared the dishes before they finished talking and retired to her room earlier than usual. She closed the door. She turned on the radio. She didn't fall asleep. What she heard from her room over the next hour were voices in the living room, the low tone of a conversation that didn't come through clearly through the door, and then silence. At 11 o'clock at night, Consuelo heard the automatic gate opening. She peeked out the window carefully. Rodrigo's car was pulling out onto the street. From the angle of her window, she couldn't see who was behind the wheel. She only saw the taillights turn the corner and disappear. Consuelo stayed by the window longer than necessary. Then she went back to bed and waited to hear the gate open again. She heard it at 1:16. She closed her eyes. She thought Rodrigo had come back. She thought everything was fine. She fell asleep, convincing herself of that. At 6 o'clock the next morning, Consuelo opened the blinds in her room. The garden was still, the ash trees motionless in the windless air. Rodrigo's car was in the garage, which was normal. What wasn't normal was that Valeria was standing in the driveway with a bucket and a sponge, cleaning the hood of the car with quick, methodical movements. Consuelo didn't move for several seconds. Valeria had never washed a car in her life. It wasn't something she was supposed to do, nor something she had ever offered to do. And yet there she was, at 6 in the morning, her hair pulled back and her eyes fixed on the hood. Consuelo went down to the kitchen. She made coffee. When Valeria came in 20 minutes later with wet hands, Consuelo asked her where Rodrigo was. "He left early," said Valeria, drying her hands with a rag. "He had a meeting." Consuelo nodded. She poured coffee without saying another word. But Rodrigo never arrived at the office before 8:30. Never. In 12 years, never. And it was 6:40. Consuelo waited until 9 before calling his cell phone. Ring, voicemail. She called again at 10. Nothing. She called the office at 11. The secretary said Mr. Castellanos hadn't arrived and hadn't left a message either. Consuelo hung up the phone slowly. Valeria was in her room with the door closed. Consuelo grabbed her purse and walked 4 blocks to the district police station in Valle Alto. She pushed open the door, approached the counter, and told the officer who attended to her that her employer had left the night before in his own car, that he hadn't returned home, that he wasn't answering his phone, and that her daughter, who was staying at the house, had been washing that car at 6 in the morning for no reason. The officer took note. He asked her to wait. Consuelo returned home. Valeria had come downstairs and was in the kitchen with the phone in her hand and an expression Consuelo had never seen on her face before. It wasn't guilt. It was something harder to read, colder, like someone waiting for the moment when something begins that can no longer be stopped. The 2 women stood in the same kitchen for 40 minutes without speaking to each other. The coffee grew cold in their cups. Outside, the Monterey sun warmed the garden, and the ash trees cast long shadows across the lawn that Rodrigo had the grass cut every 2 weeks, with a punctuality that no one would maintain anymore. Deputy Inspector Marcos Dana arrived at the house in Valle Alto at 2 in the afternoon with a partner and a notebook. It was protocol. Person not located. Last known movements. No evidence of a crime yet. He spoke first with Consuelo. He listened to her for 40 minutes. He then spoke with Valeria. She responded calmly, choosing her words carefully, with no apparent contradictions. She said that Rodrigo had gone out alone the night before, that she didn't know where, and that she had stayed home. Dina wrote everything down. He requested authorization to review the neighborhood's security cameras. The management handed them over that same afternoon. What the cameras showed stopped the deputy inspector in his tracks. At 10:43 p.m., Rodrigo's car was leaving the gated community. Rodrigo wasn't behind the wheel. There was a figure in a dark hood that the camera angle didn't allow for clear identification. In the passenger seat, motionless, was a silhouette that could be identified by their clothing. The same plaid shirt Rodrigo had worn to dinner that night. The car returned at 1:16 a.m. Only the driver. Dina closed her notebook. She picked up the phone. She requested a warrant to access the vehicle's GPS and the call logs of all cell phones linked to the address. Then she looked at her partner and whispered what they both already knew. This was not a voluntary absence. At some point that night, somewhere in Monterrey they hadn't yet located, Rodrigo Castellanos had ceased to be alive. What remained to be found was the place, the how, and everything that had happened before the cameras recorded that dark hood at the wheel of a car that no longer belonged to anyone. Rodrigo Castellanos' body was found the next day by a worker from a road maintenance company who was checking the condition of the vegetation on a stretch of dirt road west of Monterrey, 16 kilometers from the Valle Alto neighborhood. He was in the bushes, about 40 meters from the edge of the road, still wearing his plaid shirt and with the car keys in his pants pocket. The medical examiner determined the cause of death to be severe head trauma, caused by a blunt-edged metal object. There were clear signs of a struggle, scratches on his right forearm and biological material under the fingernails of both hands. Rodrigo had tried to protect himself. He hadn't been able to. Deputy Inspector Dana received the call at 8:40 in the morning. He arrived at the scene 40 minutes later. He stood in front of the body for a long moment before taking out his notebook. He had been with the Nuevo León Civil Force for 22 years and had learned to read crime scenes with the same attention others read a text. What he saw there wasn't a coincidence. The body was too deep in the brush to have fallen there on its own, too far from the road for anyone to have seen it from a moving car. Someone had brought him to that spot on purpose. That same day, the forensic team applied luminol to the interior of the car. What appeared under the ultraviolet light erased any remaining doubt. Stains on the passenger seat, on the passenger floor mat, and on the inner edge of the trunk. Carlos had cleaned carefully, but luminol finds what the eye cannot see. The blood type matched Rodrigo's in the initial lab tests. The vehicle's GPS tracked that night's route with precision that left no room for interpretation. At 10:43 p.m., the car had left the neighborhood, 20 minutes on the highway heading west, a 52-minute stop at the exact spot where they found the body. The return trip included a 9-minute stop at a gas station on the highway to Saltillo, where the exterior cameras recorded a man in a dark hoodie paying in cash at the convenience store. And finally, the return to Valle Alto at 1:16 a.m. Dana zoomed in on the gas station footage frame by frame. The hooded man was young, slender, wearing white sneakers with a gray stripe on the side. She asked her team to cross-reference that description with camera footage from the neighborhood and adjacent streets during the 48 hours prior to the crime. He appeared in 3 different recordings. In all of them, the man in the white sneakers was on foot, less than 2 blocks from the main entrance to Valle Alto. In the clearest one, taken by a grocery store's camera, he was seen in profile for 4 seconds. That was enough. While the team worked on the identification, Dana requested a warrant to access the complete call and text history from Valeria's cell phone. What they found took 2 days to analyze and produced a 64-page report. In the 3 months leading up to Rodrigo's death, Valeria had exchanged 200 messages with a number registered to Ivan Resendiz, 31 years old, residing in the Centro neighborhood of Monterrey and unemployed for the past 5 months. The messages began like any conversation between 2 close friends and, starting in the 6th week, turned into something completely different. Dana read the report in her office with the door closed. In the messages, Valeria described the house, Rodrigo's routines, the available money, and how easily she had managed to gain his trust. Ivan responded with brief, precise instructions. How to request the transfers without raising suspicion. How long to wait between them. How to maintain enough emotional distance to avoid making mistakes. In a message from day 41, Ivan wrote, "Enough with the money. We need to think about how this ends." Valeria replied with a single question mark. Ivan wrote, "You know how." Valeria didn't reply to that message, but she didn't delete the conversation either. 4 days before Rodrigo's death, the messages between them switched platforms. They moved to an encrypted messaging app. Those messages could not be fully recovered, but the app's metadata showed sessions lasting between 20 and 40 minutes over the 3 nights leading up to the crime, including a 38-minute session that began at 2 in the afternoon on the day Rodrigo died. Bank records completed the picture. The 45,000 pesos transferred from Rodrigo's account had reached Valeria's account and had been withdrawn in installments over the following weeks. Of those funds, 18,000 pesos had been sent from an ATM in the Centro neighborhood of Monterrey to a debit account registered in the name of Ivan Resendis. The same account had received 2 additional cash deposits, one of 7,000 and another of 5,000, on dates that coincided exactly with the weeks of most intense messaging. Ivan Resendis was identified from the gas station footage. His white sneakers with gray stripes appeared in a profile photo on social media, taken 3 weeks before the crime. He was arrested on the 4th day of the investigation at his downtown apartment, where forensic experts found, wrapped in a black trash bag under the bathroom sink, a 40-centimeter steel tube with biological residue at one end. The lab confirmed within 48 hours that the residue belonged to Rodrigo Castellanos. On the surface of the tube were 2 sets of fingerprints, Ivan's, and at the opposite end, partial prints that comparative analysis linked to Valeria Ibarra. Valeria was arrested that same afternoon at the house in Valle Alto. When the officers arrived, she was sitting at the garden table under the ash trees with her phone in her hand. She made no attempt to flee. She said nothing. She let them handcuff her, her eyes fixed on some spot in the garden that no one else could see. Consuelo was in the kitchen when she heard the cars in the driveway. She went out into the garden just in time to see her daughter handcuffed between 2 officers. She stood in the doorway of the glass door with her hands clasped in front of her chest. Neither of them said a word. The officers took Valeria out the front door. Consuelo remained in the doorway until the sound of the cars faded down the street. Then she went into the kitchen, sat in her usual chair, the one by the window overlooking the garden, and sat still for an unmeasured length of time. The ash trees Fernanda had planted years ago were still there, motionless, indifferent to everything that had happened beneath them. The trial of Valeria Ibarra and Ivan Resendis began 4 months after the arrests in the 11th Criminal Court of the Superior Court of Justice of Nuevo León. The courtroom was packed from the very first day. Neighbors from the Valle Alto neighborhood, colleagues from Rodrigo's company, journalists from the 2 local television stations that had been following the case since Rodrigo's name appeared on the news. It was the kind of story people followed not out of morbid curiosity, but for something more unsettling. The realization that vulnerability knows no age, position, or intelligence. Gerardo, the friend whose call Rodrigo had ignored that Friday afternoon, sat in the 3rd row from the very first day. He arrived on time and left when everyone else had already gone. He didn't speak to the journalists. He stared straight ahead with the expression of someone who has spent months grappling with a guilt that isn't entirely his own, but that he also doesn't know how to let go of. Ivan Resendis was brought in handcuffed every morning. He sat with his eyes downcast and answered his lawyer in monosyllables. He had partially admitted his involvement from the first interrogation, attempting to limit his responsibility to that of a hired hitman, someone who acted under orders. The prosecution had the messages to prove that the reality was more complex than that. Valeria arrived every day in modest clothing with her hair pulled back. She stared straight ahead. She didn't look at her mother. Consuelo Ibarra was present from the first hearing to the last. She arrived before anyone else, sat in the front row on the right side, and folded her hands in her lap. She didn't cry. She didn't speak to the press. When the cameraman tried to focus on her, she simply looked away with the patience of someone who has learned to exist within the pain, without letting the pain consume her completely. The prosecution built the case with a methodology that left no room for doubt. They presented footage from the housing development. The car leaving at 10:43 p.m., Rodrigo's motionless silhouette in the passenger seat, the hooded driver. They presented the complete GPS route, the 52-minute stop at the exact spot where the body was found, the stop at the gas station, the solitary return. They presented the luminol results, the invisible blood that someone had tried to clean from the interior of the car. They presented the steel tube with the fingerprints of both defendants and Rodrigo's biological remains. He presented the recovered messages, including the one where Ivan wrote, "You know how," and Valeria didn't reply but didn't delete it either. He presented the bank records, the 45,000 pesos leaving Rodrigo's account, splitting into Valeria's, and flowing to Ivan in payments that no one would have noticed individually. Each piece fit with the next. The jury could follow the logic effortlessly because the logic was brutal in its simplicity. A lone man, a young woman, available money, and a plan that began before Valeria first walked through the door of that house. The defense tried to sow doubt. They argued that the messages were ambiguous, that no camera had recorded the moment of the blow, that Valeria's fingerprints on the tube could have another explanation. The prosecutor responded to each argument calmly and with evidence. He didn't need to raise his voice. The evidence did that job on its own. Consuelo took the stand on the penultimate day of the trial. She was the prosecution's final witness. She walked slowly, sat down, placed her hands in her lap, and looked at the prosecutor without ever glancing toward where her daughter was sitting, less than 12 meters away from her. The prosecutor asked her about Rodrigo. Consuelo spoke of the 12 years in that house. She spoke of the man who had never disrespected her, who had given her a room with its own window and private bathroom, who had told her there was no rush when she needed days off. She spoke of their routines, of the pool at 6:15, of the coffee brewed in a pot, of how he would wash the car himself on Sundays because it was one of those little things that connected him to something that was no longer there. The prosecutor asked her about the morning she saw Valeria washing the car. Consuelo described every detail with the precision of someone who had gone over it 1,000 times in silence. The time, the bucket, the quick movements, the expression her daughter had when she looked up and saw her at the window. Then the prosecutor asked the final question. "Do you believe your daughter knew what was going to happen that night when Rodrigo drove off in his car?" The courtroom fell into absolute silence. Consuelo didn't answer right away. She looked down at her hands for a moment. Then she looked up and answered in a voice that didn't tremble. "Yes, I've believed it since day one." Valeria didn't move. She kept staring straight ahead, her eyes fixed on a point no one else could see, exactly as she had been that afternoon when the officers took her from the garden. The jury deliberated for 14 hours. Valeria Ibarra was found guilty of premeditated murder as an accomplice. Ivan Rezendiz, guilty of first-degree murder as the principal offender. The judge read the sentences as the courtroom fell silent. Valeria, 28 years with no possibility of parole for good behavior during the first 15. Ivan, 32 years. She was 20 on the day of the crime. She'll be released, if she's released, at 48. Gerardo left the courtroom without speaking to anyone. Consuelo walked out the side door, alone, jobless, homeless, without the daughter she had spoken of with pride throughout her adult life. She walked 3 blocks before stopping on the sidewalk. The Monterey sun beat down vertically on the pavement. She took out her phone, looked at it for a moment without unlocking it, and put it back. There was no one to call with good news. There was no good news. There was only a sentence, a name on a file, and 12 years of a life built in silence inside a house that no longer existed as she had known it. She kept walking.